Hi, I'm retired NYPD Detective Vic Ferrari, and welcome to NYPD Through the Looking Glass podcast, where you'll get unique insight into the New York City Police Department. Before we get started, I encourage you to check out my Amazon author page, where you'll find my series of behind-the-scenes NYPD books. They're $10 paperback, $2.99 ebook download, including my bestseller, NYPD Laughing in the Line of Duty. Today's guest is a retired sergeant turned author who's worked in the NYPD's Missing Persons Unit. John Ferriso was the author of the hot new book, All in a Day's Work, An Officer's Account, 20 Years, NYPD. I'd like to welcome a good friend of the show, John Ferriso. John, how you doing tonight?
Great. Doing great tonight, Vic. Thanks again for having me on.
No, pleasure is mine. John, you're an interesting guy, and you've worked in some of the NYPD's most mysterious units. Last episode, we discussed your time when you got shanghaied to the Internal Affairs Bureau. But on today's episode, you worked in a unit in the NYPD that people hear about, but very few people know how it works, the NYPD's Missing Persons Unit. So could you kind of go into how you got drafted into the Missing Persons Unit and what the Missing Persons Unit does?
Yeah, I actually didn't get drafted into it. I put in for it. So What happened was my time in Internal Affairs was up. And if anyone's listened to the last podcast, I did my time. And so as soon as my time was up, almost to the day, narcotics was calling my office. And they were like, "Hi, John, do you want 50 hours a month overtime? Do you want 100 hours a month overtime?" So I'm like, "All right, guys, I put in for you guys 2 years ago and you ignored me." So I said, "I'm going to the detective bureau." They're like, "Okay, if you want 100 hours." They kept upping the overtime. So I'm like, listen, thank you, but I'm going to look to go somewhere else. So I walk into my captain's office and I said, "Narcotics just called." He goes, "Oh, yeah." He goes, "If you would have said yes, they would have had a van here tomorrow morning and you would have been working for them." So I said, I had put in for narcotics. They don't want me. And no bad. They're a great bunch of guys that work there. They do an awesome job. But I put in for the detective bureau. So I had a chance encounter with someone from my neighborhood. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I told him, "Listen, I'm leaving Internal Affairs. I'm looking to go to detective bureau." And he said, "Don't go to a regular numbered squad." He goes, "Go to a special unit." So I said, "I'd love to, but I got to put in for these places. I don't have a hook." So he goes, "No." He goes, "Come to the Missing Persons Squad." He goes, "Nobody puts in for it." I was like, "Why does nobody put in for it?" He goes, "It's not known as the most glamorous." He goes, "We only handle one type of case, which is missing persons." He goes, "You're not doing robberies, you're not doing burglaries, you're not doing lineups." So he said to me, "John," he goes, "Listen," he goes, "you'll get a lot of overtime and you never have to do the ComStat." So when I heard no ComStat, for any supervisor out there is going to know what I'm talking about. That ComStat was never, I didn't ever want to do that. I don't want to be on a podium speaking to chiefs about a robbery pattern that I can't fix. So if I could avoid ComStat, which I did, and I'll admit it, I didn't want to go there. So I said, I'll put it for the Missing Persons Squad. So IAB let me leave quick, which was great. And I walked into the Missing Persons Squad, and I had just left Internal Affairs, and so I was glad I left, but I knew the harassment was going to start, but I was like, the detectives, they could be a rough bunch. These detectives, some of them had a lot of time on, and so I knew the harassment and the jokes, but I got a great personality, so I'm like, all right, bring it on. I'm ready for everything. Just throw the jokes right at me. So I walk in, and, there's a sign on the wall. It said, "Welcome to the largest missing person squad in the United States." And I'm like, really? Okay. I'm in Harlem at 148 7th Street. I'm like, it's a small office. There's a couple of desks, and they're all facing one direction. And I walk in, and I'm like, I know they're going to play a joke on me. The only thing they did was there was a rat trap on my desk on the cardboard on my, like the wall where you put like pictures and stuff. They put a rat trap there. So I was like, all right, cool. I'll leave the rat trap up. This is great. So I look around the office, and I go, oh man, I had cases on two of the guys that worked there. So
you had open cases on two of the detectives from Internal Affairs?
Yeah. Well, I knew that was going to happen. So both of those detectives, it was never, maybe, I don't know if maybe they got transferred, maybe they didn't, because I wasn't part of that aspect of it, but it wasn't anything serious. So I had cases on two of these guys, and I was like, okay, I'm like, whatever. So the IAB jokes would come around, but I was in Missing Persons now. So I noticed when I got to Missing Persons, I didn't realize how hard I was working in Internal Affairs, which may sound crazy because, like I said in the last one, there's a tremendous amount of effort into clearing an officer. But when it comes to a missing person case, it's not at the NYPD's hierarchy. There's a lot of work getting done, a lot of cases, but it's not a robbery. Technically a missing person is not a crime. It's the majority of the sometimes it does, and a lot of times it is, but it's hard to. I don't know if they go that route because a lot of there's human trafficking. There's runaways with older men. That does happen, and it's hard to prove those sometimes because the runaways, they don't want to talk after they're home. So I noticed that the volume was huge there. So they got about 7,000 cases a year. So now, how the NYPD does their missing person cases is, say the 7-5 precinct has a runaway. If that runaway, they get the case, we technically didn't get it, but we knew about it. We'd see it in the printouts or computer. So they'd have the case. If that runaway did not return in 7 days, what they did was they took the entire case, all the work, and emailed it to us, and we took it. So
the squad no longer. So the detective squad of the local precinct is out. It's strictly now handled by missing persons. Okay.
Yeah. So that's where 7,000 comes in. Now, if you count the cases that go to the precinct, it's way more. So I say 7,000, but technically, you want to get technical, there's way more than 7,000 coming into the city every year. And I'm sure that was back, I'm talking 15 years ago. So the cases would come in, and I had 8 detectives who worked for me, maybe about 5, because the guys would retire and move on, get transferred. So I say 5 to 8 guys worked for me, and these guys had some experience. A lot of guys came from narcotics. Some guys came from other detective bureaus, robbery squad, and for whatever reason they went to missing persons. So they would get the case, and I'll say that about 90% of the cases that we got after the 7 days, we closed within the first week. Yeah, we closed within the first week, 90% of them. There's a lot of reasons for that, but a week is you got to remember, a week is a long time for a person to go missing, because if a kid runs away because he hates his parents, after about a week, he's going to realize his parents maybe weren't that bad, because this kid's living in the street and he's sleeping on couches. Once the weather gets bad or something, or he runs out of money, he gets sick, he'll come back. Or if a runaway girl ends up with the boyfriend that starts hitting her, she's going to come home. And so within a week, I would say about 90% got closed. There were a lot of suicides, so we just had to find the body. And there was a lot of times when the squad just was overwhelmed. They might have had a robbery pattern in the 4-1, and they're not going to look into Miss Rodriguez, who walked out of the nursing home at 2 in the morning. They're not really putting a lot of effort into it. So there was times that we got the case, and it was as simple as, okay, let's interview the neighbor. And the neighbor's like, well, she's been staying next door. You see what I mean? Like, that's how we closed a lot of them, because the squads were overwhelmed.
People don't realize that. So, like what John was saying earlier about a numbered precinct, there's 77 NYPD precincts, and every precinct, usually on the second floor, there's a big office with anywhere, depending on the size of the precinct, between 5 and maybe 30 detectives. And these guys are handling everything: bounce checks, missing persons, homicides, domestic violence, missing jewelry, you name it. Robberies, they're handling it, and they are overwhelmed. And to make things worse, like John talked about earlier, it's CompStat became this centralized thing where precinct commanders and borough commanders had to go down to one police plaza and stand up in front of a podium and explain what they're doing about these cases. And I get it that you want to hold people accountable and hold their feet to the fire and see what they're doing, but it became Lord of the Flies down there, and then supervisors didn't want to go down there and get embarrassed. A lot of guys went down to CompStat and never came back. They were either forced into retirement, or they got their command taken away from them, and they turned up as like a borough captain on the midnight, running around doing 49s for police shootings. So CompStat ended a lot of careers, and it also kind of screwed up the detective bureau, because when John and I got hired, a detective in a precinct was like one of the most coveted jobs in the police department, and the NYPD basically ruined it. I mean, they took the fun out of being a precinct detective, old gumshoe going around getting leads, because they didn't give anybody any time to solve these cases because they were on their ass. What are you doing about this? And then they're bringing them downtown, which is a waste of time. I used to say, and that bled into organized crime, because when in auto crime, my lieutenant would say a week before Comstat, because I was the only one that knew how to use the computers, Vic, I need you to give me a printout of everybody that's on parole for auto theft in the 5 boroughs. And I'm sitting there just printing. Great. I need you to interview these 50 guys and ask them if they're still stealing cars. I'm like, first of all, I don't think that's legal. Second of all, these guys don't live at these addresses. They gave their fucking parole officer when they got out. No one knows where this guy is. He's got a warrant already. But anyway, I know I got on a tangent there. But they killed the detective bureau. But thank God for units like yours, where you guys had the time. That was your avenue of expertise. And like you said, someone walks out of a nursing home, you guys know, all right, let's start talking to the neighbors around by the nursing home.
Yeah, the elderly, people that just walk out of the nursing home was common. And we had a lot of suicides too, which was sad, but we had some suicides that you knew. I read a lot of suicide notes late at night in that office, and they were sad to read, and there was commonality in a lot of them, and there was times they straight up said it, and you knew where they were. We couldn't just find the body. There was other times when we had cars parked on the Verrazano Bridge with the keys on the dashboard, door opened, and a witness that said they saw him jump. Now, technically, that's a missing person. We know he went to Verrazano somewhere, and he drifted. So that was a missing person. So if you find the body, it's closed. But if you don't, that case stays open. And the suicides that goes into the 10% I was talking about. That's why they stay open, because we couldn't find the body.
So you were into police work like I was. And when I got transferred to the auto crime division, the first thing, well, not the first thing, but eventually one day, I was in a satellite office in the Bronx, so our main office was in Queens. And I remember one time they had me out there on a midnight answering phones, because every team would take turns answering the phones on the midnight. And I remember in auto crime, whenever you made an arrest or did a search warrant, you had to fill out a card, an index card, staple the guy's photo on it, and write out all this information. And I read the book Murder Machine, which was about the DeMeo crew out in Brooklyn with all these homicidal killers. And I was like, I work in auto crime. The first thing I did was I started looking up these famous cases and pulling out their cards and looking at their photos. I was like a kid in a candy store looking at the old-time thieves that I read about. Did you look up any of the more famous missing persons cases in New York?
Yes, and I'm going to tell a quick story here. It's in my book, and the story is called One Phone Call 33 Years Later. And the story, I'll start from the beginning, and then I got to go to the end of my career. So when I was 9 years old, I was living in Queens, and Etan Patz went missing. So I'm sure you're familiar with that case. Etan Patz went missing in Manhattan in 1979. And anyone in your audience who does not know who Etan Patz is, you could Google it. It's a closed case, and he was the first kid on the milk carton. A lot of people don't know that he was the first kid to be put on a milk carton. So that's where that got started. So when I was 9 years old, that was on the news every night, and I'm watching it because I was already into police work. Like I said in the last interview, I was into police work at a young age, and I had I had a drive to learn about it. So, but what's interesting was, the news was funny because they started doing like shock news. They were like, Etan Patz has been abducted and he's sold into a pedophile ring by adults. So as a little kid, I'm watching this and I'm saying, my gosh, what the heck just happened in Manhattan? This kid's in a pedophile ring. Then like there was witnesses coming forward saying they saw him with grown men in cars, and it was very scary.
He was all over the place.
Yeah, and there was no leads. Looking back on the case, there's no leads. So I became afraid to leave my house as a little kid. So I used to tell my parents, I would say, well, what happens if I go missing? And they would, oh, what happens if I can't find you guys? I started locking the doors when they weren't home. So I was afraid to leave the house because I was afraid that I was going to get lost or these pedophiles were in the neighborhood. So a year or two later, I totally forgot about it. I became a teenager. I did my thing. The Etan Patz case, it didn't cross me no more. So years later, I'm in the missing persons squad. And my supervisor calls me in the office and says, John, we are the lead investigators in the Etan Patz case. So I'm like, wow. So he shows me Etan Patz's picture. It brought back so many memories because that's the same picture they used to show on the news. So I'm like, wow. So he tells me the detective's name who has the case. I knew that detective I used to work with him. So I approached the detective and I said, I know you got the Patz case. Now I told nobody about, being afraid and everything. You can't tell cops those things. I'll get abused. So
I know.
So I'll get abused. So I'm talking to the detective and we sat down. He showed me the case. There was a suspect back in 1979. There was a pedophile in the neighborhood. He was a suspect, and they were still looking at him. This detective had interviewed him in prison. So I didn't tell this detective about it, what my experience with as a child. So I went in the back office, and there was old cases, and the whole wall of Etan Patz. So started taking the boxes off the wall. So I was finding these old, those reel-to-reel tapes? I don't know if you remember them, the old reel-to-reels. Yeah. So a lot of interviews some of the interviews said, do not play this tape without prior permission of the district attorney. So I'm like, all right, I wouldn't even be able to know how to find the machine for this anyway. So I started taking out the pictures. They were getting strange stuff sent there from people all over the country. You have to look in this ditch. You have to look here. A lot of crazy stuff. A lot of interviews back in the day. So every once in a while I would go back and I would look at the old folders. So one day I'm in the office and these two guys walk in with suits. So I knew they were not NYPD. I looked at these guys. I said, who are these guys? They look like businessmen. They were FBI. So the FBI's there. So being that he was accused of getting taken out of state, the FBI still had that as an abduction. So the FBI had the case. They were looking at DNA. So one of the boxes had his toys in it. So it was very, very sad. Little kids' toys from the 70s, very similar toys that I remembered. So I was like, wow. They had books with his drawings and everything. So they were trying to get DNA. So a couple of weeks go by and they're digging up a basement in Lower Manhattan. Somebody that was interviewed back in 1979, something clicked with this guy, and the FBI said, we're going to go dig his basement. They dug his basement up, and everybody from the office left except for me, one detective, and a civilian. So I was a little annoyed. I was like, I'm not part of the dig here. All right, I'm the supervisor. I guess at that day, I was supervising the entire city for missing persons because everybody was at the dig. So the phone's ringing Saturday morning. Phone's ringing in the back. Civilian picks up the phone. She comes up to me. She goes, get on the phone. He knows where the kid is. So I'm like, I had another case, which I wrote about in my book, of a missing kid that's still active from Brooklyn. So I thought somebody was giving a tip about that kid. But we used to get a lot of tips about that. So I told the detective, pick up the phone, talk to this guy, and take the notes, and we'll see what we got to do. So the detective picks up the phone. He was the only detective in the office. He's writing. I see he's writing Etan Patz. So I'm like, wow. So he's writing. Gets the information, puts the phone down, looks at me, and goes, Sarge, we just solved the Etan Patz case. I was like, whoa. Now everything came back to me. I'm like, my gosh, when I was a kid, I was afraid of this. So I'm like, he told me the whole story. It's common, you can because the guy was convicted. Basically, someone came forward and overheard this guy's confession. So the guy said, stop digging. I know who it is. You need to find this guy. So we sent the statement to the supervisors and the detective who had the case. They stopped what they were doing. They went out and investigated that guy. They went to Brooklyn. Guy confessed.
Was the body ever recovered?
He claims he put the body in the garbage.
That story went viral. I mean, and this is before cable news. I mean, like you said, Etan Patz was the first kid on milk containers. And I mean, it was everywhere. It was like the Son of Sam case for a while. It just, for years. And like you said, everybody, and we had that conversation off air. There was a guy that lived in a drainage tunnel in Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx that was a suspect that they really thought it was him. And I think he used to go back and forth from Pennsylvania. And I think he was accused or convicted of sex crimes in Pennsylvania, if memory serves me correctly. So that guy was the guy that he was convicted, right? The guy.
Yeah, the guy that the person said overheard him confess, and then they eventually convicted him on his confession, and he went to trial, and he got convicted of the child's murder without ever finding the body, because he said he threw the body out in the garbage. And he had also, he had a connection to the neighborhood there. Not exactly sure. He had a connection to the neighborhood. He was interviewed, he wasn't interviewed, but there was a connection with him with the 1979 case somehow.
In your time in missing persons, have you ever come across a case where you found a person that didn't want to be found?
Oh, yeah. But
they just said, you know what? Screw this. I'm going off the grid.
A lot of domestics that were just really bad marriages that, we would... It's odd. It's like they never really called you and said, hey, you'd get the phone call and be like, listen, I'm not missing. I'm home. And we would send a detective there, and then we'd find them. A lot of times it had to do with husband and wife. Maybe one of the family members was getting remarried and didn't want to stay with the person, so they split, and then the person was trying to report them missing when actually the other person just didn't want to talk to them anymore. So it was always a gray area, because if a husband is reporting a wife missing, at first you're like, yeah, she ran away from him, but we had cases when they were homicides. So you always had to take the case, because he could be reporting his wife missing after he murdered her. But we had people that went off the radar, but I was never a believer, and I've never seen a case ever. I know Hollywood loves to write about this, and show it, and writers write about it. I never worked a case where someone went off the grid totally and is just out on the lam somewhere. The reason why is because you have to cut ties with everybody. You have to get rid of all your social media. You have to go live in the woods. I'm not saying criminals haven't done that. Perps, they'll do that.
Oh, yeah.
But to go missing, that is a tremendous amount of effort. So I've never worked a case of that. But we did have cases when maybe a week, 2 weeks, we eventually found them, and they were like, yeah, I'm home, I'm fine. You can close this case. Well, okay.
So we had this conversation earlier. I remember as a young cop being in a detective squad, and up on the wall I saw a phone number for a psychic. And I started to laugh. I'm like, why would there be a number of a psychic in New York City Police Department police station? And people are fascinated with psychics. And I remember asking a detective in my office, do you call a psychic? And they said, it's one of those things where that can really screw up your case, because say it's a missing persons or something in a homicide, and you make an arrest, and you're going to have to do a 5, which is paperwork that you actually contacted a psychic. That could screw up your case, because the defense attorney's going to say, you think my client did it, you called a friggin' psychic? I mean, they're going to make a sideshow of this. So was the missing persons unit ever involved with the psychic?
Yes. You're making me laugh, Vic, because, they used to call like they always called after 9 o'clock at night. And I was the night supervisor, so they used to call, and I can imagine how many times.
Oh wait, psychics would call the missing persons unit?
Yes, yeah, they would call.
Well, they work nights. When you're working with the dead.
Well, oh yeah, I got a story about that. So
So wait. So you're sitting in the missing persons unit, and a psychic calls you after 9.
Yeah.
Well, what do they say?
Oh, I could go into a whole thing with that. Now, it's funny is that cops' humor, right? Yeah. If a psychic's calling, you're going to start transferring him to everybody, and everybody's going to talk to him. Think about it. So, like I said, everybody knew I joked around a lot. So I was like, they're like, Sarge, Mr. Jones is on the phone. He says he sees him in his dream. I'm like, put him on the phone. I'll talk to him. I'm like, Mr. Person Squad, Sergeant Ferriso, what's going on tonight, Mr. Jones? So the first time I dealt with a psychic was, and this is another thing, like I said before, Hollywood shows it. Writers talk about it. They are 100% wrong, and I'll explain how they're wrong and how they're doing it. And I'll explain how psychics are actually dealing with the missing persons and any other unit I could think of. The first time I noticed it was one of my detectives had a case where a 17-year-old kid went, just didn't come home from school one day. And to this day, it's an active case. Could be a suicide. It could be a homicide. We don't know. So this detective was getting phone calls from a psychic. So this psychic said, trunk of a car, parked here, friends hit him in the back of the head. It was like a really long, drawn-out thing. So she used to take notes on this and put them in her folder. So she's on vacation once, so I had to we were getting tips on this case from legitimate tips. So I'm reading about a body in a car and hitting the back of the head. So I'm like, detective, what are you talking about here? And he's like, well, that's the psychic that calls me. And so I'm like, okay, listen, if you want to talk to the psychic, fine. But like you said, you do not put this an official report. And I said, not only that, we cannot go to the scene on anything they say. You could talk to them all you want, but we're not going following a lead from a psychic. So I had a case of a missing kid, and we had a psychic that used to call the detective. So the detective at first used to think it was funny. So detective said the psychic's on the phone, I'm like, yeah, talk to him. So the psychic used to I don't know, these two guys were on the phone more than I expected. I think it was going on more than a joke. So one night they're on the phone, and I was writing at that time. So I'm in my office and I'm taking notes about these cases because I'm going to write a book. So some other detective runs in the office and goes, Detective so-and-so's on the phone with that wacko again. So I'm like, yeah. He goes, I don't know, I think they like each other or something. So I'm like, I don't know, he's the psychic. And he calls me and I go, what do you mean you think he likes him? And he goes, no, they like each other. I'm like, okay, I don't want to get involved. So detective comes in and goes, listen, Sarge, the psychic keeps calling me. So I'm like, listen, we can't do any investigation at this. So one day, the missing's family was doing a fundraiser. So we did a little undercover work and we went in the crowd with the fundraiser. So I was in the crowd and he was in the crowd. So on a side note, the detective's in the crowd and he's got an old school camera and he's taking pictures of everybody like he's part of the fundraiser. The people without giving up too much of this case, it's in my book, but the people at the fundraiser were calling the wrong office because we found out later on. They were like, there's a really strange guy here taking pictures of us. We don't know where he is. You have to investigate him. They were talking about the detective because he was at the fundraiser and they didn't know who he was. So they were dropping dimes on the detective thinking you need to investigate this guy. He's at a fundraiser. We don't know who he is. So I'm in the crowd. So the detective comes up. What I would do is I would sit in the crowd as they were walking. They would take breaks and sit on benches. So they would talk about the missing kid. So I would sit next to people and hear if they're talking about, because we always suspected there was more than we were being told. So I would sit and listen to the crowd, and I had to listen to their conversations. It had nothing to do with the missing kid. So I would put in my report, nothing to do with the missing child. So the detective comes up to me and goes, Sarge, the psychic's here. I'm like, he's here? He goes, yeah, he's in the crowd. So I'm like, I'm not dealing with this guy. So I told the detective, I said, listen, I don't know how this psychic ended up here, but that's the closest of a psychic ever coming into the office. So on that same case, I'm in my office one night and, oh no, not that same case. It's another case. The civilian puts this, she's like, Sarge, this psychic keeps calling. Can you talk to him? So it was late at night. It was 10 o'clock. It was on a Wednesday or something. It was quiet. I'll talk to him. So he went into this bizarre story about, we have a case that you could view it online, which meant that missing persons would put up on their missing persons website, and it was a kid that went missing. He's an adult, he's not a kid. So we never knew what happened to him. So this guy tells me, I know where he is and I know where he's buried. So I'm like, he told me he's a psychic. So I'm like, well, how do you know that you are a psychic? So he told me that he gets visited by spirits. So he said that no, it's getting good. He told me, this is the conversation I'm having 10 o'clock at night in an office, and I'm a supervisor in the NYPD. The guy's like, late at night, spirits from the French Revolution visit me. So I'm like, okay, really? So he gets into this whole long, drawn-out story about the French Revolution. So I'm a history guy, so I'm like, oh, okay, that's cool. So, and then I go, okay, look, what's going on with this missing? Why'd you call me? And he goes, well, his boyfriend was a construction worker and murdered him and put him in the construction site, and he gave me the address of the building where he's buried. So I'm like, I can't go and dig up the floor of a building because you're telling me he's under the floor.
Based on some crackpot that's calling you at 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah. So I kind of thanked him. I'm like, listen, you called, but we can't. And he's like, okay. But if I didn't cut off that phone call, that guy would have just kept going. So psychics
You should have told him to get a shovel and have him dig him up.
I think he was waiting for us to do it. So psychics are interesting people because, well, not interesting, but it's interesting because Hollywood puts them in the cop stories a lot, and writers put them in. It does have to do with missing person stories a lot. Now, Hollywood and writers put them in where they show up in the office, and they're always yelling, I'm the psychic. This I never saw one show up in my office. One did show up at the fundraiser once, but I'm wondering if him and the detective were talking together and he showed up. I don't know
how that would be. If a psychic showed up at a crime scene or a detective squad, they'd get the bums rush right through the door.
Probably.
The
CEO.
You know what?
Yeah. But,
yeah,
the guys that worked with,
they
sit down and give him coffee.
Get this guy out of here.
But first they would have sat down, gave him coffee, and listened to him for 20 minutes, then go, out the door, go.
Well, so like you said, it's funny when they call up and you got him on the phone and you go, all right, you know what? I'm going to put you through to this guy, because when an EDP, a emotionally disturbed person, calls up a precinct, like you said, you're going to bounce that call around. Yeah, I got a hot tip for you. And you're going to plug the call into your friend who's going to go, what the frig is this? And he's going to send it to the next guy. That guy will be on the phone all night circulating. But like you said, it's funny at 10 o'clock at night. But when they start showing up, then, that could be a problem.
Well, I think if you entertain them, they will. I don't know the background with these psychics. I don't deal with them. In my missing persons work with my private eye business, I tell my clients, once you start saying you're looking for somebody, if a psychic contacts you, I'd advise you not to talk to them. And some of them are like, you mean to tell me a psychic's going to call me? I go, yes. If you keep this case open, eventually one will call you. I don't know why they're attracted to these cases. I can't explain it. It's what they do. I believe that's what it is. I don't entertain them. I didn't even put them in my book because I didn't feel it fit in the book, but it's an interesting story to tell.
Yeah, it's like feeding a cat. You'll never get rid of them.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of the unclaimed dead, most of the unclaimed dead winds up in the morgue. How often did your detectives or did you have to go down to the morgue to fingerprint the unclaimed dead?
Well, it's funny you said that because the missing persons squad had a morgue unit. So what it was there was detectives who had prior experience in morticians. Mortician experience. Sure. So they would work only in the morgue. And sometimes I'd have to go down there. And I'd have to, if the supervisor wasn't in, I'd have to do work. So one day my captain calls me in the office. He goes, John, I got a special assignment for you. He goes, do you want it? I says, well, you got to tell me what it is first. He goes, I'll give you a take-home car. I'll give you a cell phone. I'll give you a laptop. It's getting better. He goes, I'll give you the same overtime. You could start from your house. So I'm like, well, what's the catch? He goes, you have to stay at the morgues all day long. So I go, I never became a cop to stay at the morgue. I can't do it. I says, it's not for me. I go, missing persons has enough death. I'm already reading suicide notes weekly. I cannot stay at the morgue. So I went back to the office. So the morgue supervisor came in and goes, John, you don't want it? I go, no. He goes, I don't blame you. He goes, I can't deal with this anymore. So what the morgues would do is they had detectives who worked there. So if a body shows up, they would print them. And if the prints came back, sometimes prints come back to nobody. You get an old man that dies, has never been arrested, those prints come back to nobody. You could have a guy that, crossed the border, he's not a citizen. Those prints ain't coming back to anybody. So the body would sit there, and if they, 15 years ago, DNA was not taken for a body in the morgue if it was just a regular alcoholic who died in the street. If they had ID and everything, then it wasn't an unclaimed. So, and what would also happen is the nursing homes and the hospitals would send the body to the morgue, and they would say, this guy's 99 years old, he never has a visitor, he has ID, we know who he is, but he has no family. So a lot of times elderly people will outlive everybody they know. So no one's claiming him. And if this guy had not a dime to his name, there's nobody burying him. So they would take the body and they would send it to what's called City Cemetery, which is in an island off the coast of the Bronx. It's been in a few movies. And So they would bury them there. There's a whole system with that. I'm not sure how it works. I do know that there are unclaimed bodies buried there. There's some type of marker. But my experience with the cold cases is that some of these cold cases, I'm talking long 60s, 70s, could have been when you had a person went missing, but the body was located and the prints didn't come back or the prints weren't taken, and that body went unclaimed to the morgue. So there's people buried there that I firmly believe are still reported missing.
Yeah, there's a work detail. So what happens is the bodies go out to Department of Corrections. gets them. Well, things have changed, but I mean, when I retired, so a couple of times a week there'd be a ferry in City Island, which is off the coast of this island, and it was a work detail of Rikers Island's inmates, guys that were going to be in jail less than a year. They were trustees, and they would go out on a ferry with these pine boxes several times a week, and I think they bury 8 in a hole.
That's what I heard. Yeah.
I wrote it in one of my books. I don't have it in front of me, but yeah, it's sad. I mean, and there's over 1 million people buried at this island. I think Typhoid Mary's. There's a lot of Typhoid Mary's buried out. There's a lot of famous people. You would never know it. And this island, Hart's Island, I think during the Cold War in the late 50s, early 60s, the United States government housed Ajax. There was a battery of Ajax missiles there in case the Russians were going to get too close to us. So it's an island with a lot of history. I mean, when I was a kid, a couple of times we got close to it with a boat, but there's a ton of signs like, do not, don't come any closer, Department of Corrections, no trespassing. But yeah, that's where the unclaimed dead goes. Well, when you started fingerprinting, well, not you, but when your unit would fingerprint the unclaimed dead, were a lot of cases solved that way? So you fingerprint a guy and he's wanted for a homicide, or a guy is wanted for a rape. How often did that happen where there was somebody with active warrants that wound up in the morgue with no ID?
Yeah, we had that a few times, because there was times we had the detective would close the case because, the guy was wanted and they found out who he was. So if you have an old guy that he's got an old warrant, those prints come back. So by closing the warrant, sometimes you actually close the missing because you can notify the family. So once the family's notified, it's closed. It's considered closed. So if someone's wanted, now when they say wanted, you're not missing, but technically if you're dead, you're no longer wanted. So that's it. No one's looking for you. I'm talking it's as simple as we called the grandson. Okay, he's dead. We closed the case. If you want to pick him up, that's where he is. Yeah, that's basically as simple as that.
You brought something up that reminded me of a story about like the guys in missing persons that work at the morgue. So I got a couple of years on the job. I'm working in a precinct, and there's this rookie cop, and I took a liking to him. He's a nice kid. And I asked him, we're making small talk, and he tells me he was an embalmer, and he was a funeral director. And I said, why don't you go to the missing persons unit? And he goes, what do you mean? So I explained it to him, right? And I says, what are you doing here? You should do that, right? Kid puts in for it, and he's gone like in 15 minutes. Like, soon as that application went in, it's like, this is a no-brainer. Like, the NYPD, you can put in for something. You can wait decades before you get transferred. They wanted this kid. So he's gone, and I don't see this kid for years. You know how the NYPD is. I mean, there's 40,000 members. Somebody goes to another borough. You may never see them again. You might not run into them at a parade or a demonstration, just different lifestyle. So anyway, I forgot all about this kid. About 15 years later, right? My old partner, I'm in auto crime, and he goes, do you know when he drops the guy's name? And I go, oh, yeah, great guy. He's in missing persons. He goes, not anymore. I go, what do you mean not anymore? I go, he's a detective in missing persons. He goes, he left the job. I go, why did he leave the job? He goes, he's my dentist. I says, what are you talking about? He goes, so like with our union, there's a list of providers, like, that'll take our dental insurance. He finds this guy, I think it was up in Westchester County somewhere, right? The guy's got it, he's pulling his tooth out. He had a toothache, right? And he figures out that my old partner's a cop, and I used to be on the job. Where'd you work? And goes, do you know Vic Ferrari? And he goes, oh yeah. He goes, yeah. So anyway, my partner's like, yeah, he speaks very highly of you. He says, you ever got a problem? Come see him. I'm like, I'm not gonna go see him. He goes, why? I go, I know where his fingers were.
Yeah.
He's fingerprinting dead people. I don't want his fingers in his mouth. I like the guy. I'm sure he's a great dentist. And I mean, you got to have a high IQ to become a funeral director and embalmer, become an NYPD detective, and then wind up as a dentist. I mean, salute. I mean, he's high IQ, but like, I didn't want him screwing around in my mouth.
Every once in a while, they would call us out to a detail. Now, for the non-law enforcement out there, detail is when you got to put on the uniform, you leave your office, and you go to St. Patrick's Day Parade. You go to the West Indian Day Parade. So one day I had to go to a detail, and they gave me all the morgue guys, the guys from the morgue. So I'm like, I'm going to deal with all the morgue guys. So I get there, and I didn't really know them because these guys just deal with dead bodies all day long, and I wasn't quick to go to the morgue to see them. I talked to them on the phone all the time and signed their reports. So I was always joking with him. I'm like, okay, it's a parade. There's people walking around. Very different from what you're used to. People are going to talk to you here. Everybody's alive. So they were like, yeah, funny. But we would throw jokes at these morgue guys. They had a great sense of humor. Listen, when you work in the morgue or you're a mortician, you can't hide it. That's just the way it is. You just got to go with it.
You're either going to have a great sense of humor or you're going to snap.
Some of them were dry. Some of them were very dry, and we used to joke about that too. We used to be like, come on, don't act like a stiff, you know. Then I would always throw the ongoing joke, like I used to say, listen, when you guys order Chinese food or pizza, do you take it in the morgue or do you eat outside? And what if a body gets up? They would just look at me like, what are you talking about? Because we would always throw jokes about them ordering lunch there and stuff like that. Because I never understood how they did it. Because they had to get like suited up in like this Tyvek suit all the time. Because I've been to, when you go to a homicide, you got to go the next morning to the morgue. So I've been to the morgue.
Yeah, ID the body.
Yeah, you got to ID the body. And I went when I was a rookie once, and they were like, cops are like, yeah, Ferriso, you got to go ID this body. So I'm like, for that? They're like, the guy died. I'm like, all right, I guess because he's dead. Yeah, I get it. So I go there, and this is before missing person days, and I'm talking to the funeral director, and she's like, okay, is this the body? I'm like, yeah. She's like, sign this. As I'm signing, I hear this drilling and sawing. They're cutting the guy open as I'm talking. As soon as I said that's his body, they started cutting him open. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to just backstep. I signed the papers. I'm just going to leave. And I had this whole suit on and everything and a mask. So these guys that worked in the morgue had to pretty much get suited up every day. And I guess they became the expert at printing DOAs.
Yeah, I know they got to if the body's been out a long time, they've got to inject their fingers with like saline solution to kind of puff them up to roll them on the ink cards. I know that it's like a whole art of how to ID a dead person.
Well, we used to get interesting things because there was about 20 detectives that worked there, and so now even though we were the missing person squad, you had one person that dealt with the group homes, one who dealt with the morgues, which was my guy. There was one who dealt with unclaimed bodies and body parts, and you had everybody else just
wait, back up. So how often did body parts turn up?
Not as often as you think. It happens. We used to I don't want to give up the city agency, but one city agency called our offices like, listen, you guys got to come with us because we keep finding feet and shoes in the water. Yeah. So everybody's like, oh my gosh, there's a serial killer. There's a serial killer. So I'm like, I was thinking about it. They were correct. They were doing some type of diving, the city agency, and they kept coming across shoes, and there was feet in the shoes. And I'm not joking. This was the calls we got. So it was legit. There was body parts. I just think maybe it had to do with the current, and it went to this one location. So the city agency did the right thing and said, listen, you guys got to investigate this. We can't work if there's body parts in the area. So I always felt, and I've talked about this a little bit with networking with other missing person people, is that the reason, because I know that they're claiming that it's like a serial killer thing. I think it's more of the shoe kind of, or the boot becomes like an encasement for the foot. So the rest of the body will get pulled out to sea. Or if it's in the desert.
Right, and the foot gets stuck in the silt.
Yep. So the shoe is a container. So I believe that those body parts were actually from different people. It wasn't just one person. Now,
how many feet did you find?
I didn't go to the scene. The detectives that went, there was more than two, so it had to be more than one person. And I think they were boots and shoes.
With feet?
Yeah. Boots and shoes, yeah. So now what they'll do is they'll take that body part and there's a case on it. So there's a detective right now somewhere in the NYPD with a case of a body part. Because I had a case when I had a missing runaway who never returned, and whenever they would find a body part for someone young, it was a big thing. The missing part, we used to call it the bells and whistles. As the ages get lower, the bells and whistles would go off, which meant that this is something for us. So there was a place that used to do recycling, and the recycling workers came across a body in a bag, and it was a torso of a teenager. So I tried to match it up with some of the cases I had. So there are body parts that they get called in and they'll just like, listen, construction workers will be like, listen, we're doing work on the floor and there is a dead body in a bag underneath the floorboards. So it happens. And it becomes a case.
I remember
Very
out
hard
in
to prove.
Brooklyn.
The chances of the chances of arresting somebody on that is like hitting lotto. I know you'll find a detective somewhere in the nation that did, but I never saw anybody arrested for any of those cases.
When they started, there's that property off the Belt Parkway in Brooklyn. It might be part of that old Fountain Avenue dump. I remember when they were building out there, they had to stop every 15 minutes because they kept finding old body parts from God knows when. And they think a lot of it had to do with, I was talking about earlier, that DeMayo crew, but it was probably a dumping ground for the 5 families. But I think what happened was after like the 5th or 6th time, the construction company was like, screw this. Just keep building, like, just keep going with the bulldozer, because it was like, I remember it was in the paper, like almost every day they were finding body parts out there.
Yeah. When I was in the missing persons, we never had an area like that was constantly finding it, but it was periodic. I know after Hurricane Sandy, the storm, they were finding them, which meant that a guy's porch was destroyed and they found a missing person buried under his porch that was actually missing out of the same building. So someone got reported missing in the building, and they buried him under the porch the whole time. And Hurricane Sandy pulled the boards away, and they located him.
Did they make an arrest with that?
When I was there, no. But it was I'm sure if they did some work into it. Now, if there was an arrest, it would probably go back to the original detectives, because detectives who originally had that case would take it as a homicide, and they would re-look at that. I don't remember arrest being made on that case, but I wouldn't be surprised if it did, because there's something to go with, because the person was reported missing in the year 2000. The body was found in Hurricane Sandy, so it's not even really that old of a case. Yeah. So I had a case once. This one I wrote about in my book. It's called "He Was Under the Mattress." So you can see where this is going. So what happened was, I used to get what's called communications, which was, it's not really a case, but it should be looked at. So what would happen is the supervisors got it, and I had to investigate it. So basically, a woman, let's say she's in another state. She says, listen, my husband has issues. He goes to Queens to his friend's house. He went one night, never came home. So I'm like, okay, well, you live in another state. How do you even know he's here? She goes, I know he's in Queens. I go, why? She goes, he got a parking ticket on this block, which was a block, like in Queens. So now, remember I said the detectives get the case in the beginning? How this case made it. 7 days. Yeah. I don't know how, but they still had it. So the lady tells me on the phone, she gives me the detective's name, and she says, this is the detective who's investigating it. Now, I was the supervisor, so technically I'm his supervisor at this moment, because it's called a communication. It's not really a case, but they tell you it's not a case, but if you don't do it, you're going to get in trouble, so might as well just do it. So I did some work, so I called the detective up, and I'm like, so what do we got with this? He goes, you know what? I think the guy's, went to his friend's house and something happened. So I'm like, really? He goes, yeah. He goes, because he got a parking ticket in Queens, and the wife said he lives there, and it's like very close distance. So the detective goes, listen, I'm going to do some work. I've been to the house a few times. So he goes, I'm going to go back. So I'm like, all right. So I would call the detective about once a week. Now, I had a lot of these cases, which were called communications. And so I called the detective a week later, and I'm like, Sergeant Ferriso, what do you got with that case in Queens? And he's like, oh, I found the body. So I'm like, you found the body? And I was surprised. He goes, yeah, he was in the house. I go, he's in the house. He goes, he was in his friend's house. I go, the body was in his friend's house? He goes, yeah. He goes, that was a party house. They used to go there to do some stuff. And he goes, I kept knocking on the door, and the guy's like, I haven't seen my friend. And after a few times he went there, the guy goes, all right. He tells the detective, let's go in the basement. I'll show you him. So they go in the basement. They said there was a pile of mattresses. He was on the one mattress. There was a bunch of them on the top of them. They used to party in the basement. And what happened was he was down there and had a heart attack and died. So they just threw a mattress on him. And then when it started to smell, they threw another mattress. And this went on for weeks. And his friends were going in the basement and hanging out. So I'm assuming
they call 911.
No, they just kept putting mattresses over him. So I guess they locked up the owner of the building for, I guess, the only thing is unlawful disposal of a body. That's because he didn't murder him. He just left him there. So when I presented the case,
probably had a heart attack, and they were all smoking crack, And they didn't want to get locked up. Yeah.
Yeah, so they just covered him. So I had to hand the communication in. So one of my supervisors had been in narcotics, and he's like, there's some hardcore junkies in that place. So that's in my book, that story.
And John, what is the name of your book, and where can our listeners find it?
Yes. It's called All in a Day's Work, An Officer's Accounts, 20 Years NYPD. You can find that on Amazon
Ferriso.
Kindle. Yes, by John Ferriso.
It's available on Amazon Kindle, and is it available anywhere else?
Amazon Kindle.
Okay. John, I want to thank you again for spending this time with us. And as always, I want to thank everyone for tuning in, especially my friends in Aberdeen City, Rammer, Alabama, Eatontown, New Jersey, Mike the Irish Paisan and his brother in New Haven, Connecticut, and of course, Stephen Bigelow in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. If you work in law enforcement and have an interesting criminal background and would like to be a guest on the show, please drop me a note on Twitter or Instagram at VicFerrari50. If you enjoyed the content, check out my Amazon author page. Type in my name, Vic, Ferrari like the car, where you can preview all my books for free, including NYPD Law and Disorder. John Ferriso's book, I will link the book link to my YouTube and this podcast page. John, thank you again for being on this episode, and I'll see everyone next week. Thank you.
Thanks again, Vic.